One thing I essentially see in a lot of political communities, at least especially recently, all over the entirety of the internet, is entirely the question of the labor theory of value and the subjective theory of value. Um, like between the two on who is right on who is right when we actually when we actually go on to these economic ideas on and especially on how any kind of theory of value is applied to capitalism of today. Um, and one of these and two of these debates we're going to be focusing on. At least I think we should be focusing two theories of value that is usually kind of focused on when we're discussing this is the labor theory of value, mostly developed by Adam Smith and David Ricardo, and the subjective theory of value, developed by people of the Austrian School of Economics, such as Mises and Rothbard. Um, and but the thing is, the reason why there's entirely two different theory of values when Adam Smith and David Ricardo and the Austrian School of Economics were indeed both capitalists. The reason here is because Karl Marx used the labor theory of value to essentially come into his conclusions that the worker class is basically exploited out of their own labor power for them selling their labor power to a capitalist that would soon basically sell their product to a market and have to pay for resources and all these things to for them to essentially keep working and for the business day to come back and for them to essentially get money they would have to essentially they would essentially have to either increase the kind of like price of the product or cut the worker's wage. Either way, someone is getting exploited. This is the consumer or the worker. Either, and this is like what led Marx to essentially understand the ideas of capitalism as well as critique it onto its exploitative nature, basically of capitalism eating its own population, as he said. So, and the main critics of and a lot of people essentially looked into this, and when people started reading on this, a lot of people did come into conclusions of Karl Marx. This is why there was essentially a mass movement like of Marxism in the Paris Commune and even in Russia, as we can see. A lot of people were coming to these conclusions, even here in the United States, looking into the labor theory of value. So for entirely the United States or entire capitalists to make sure that people do not come to these conclusions, these radical conclusions, especially in the heights of the Cold War, or in the heights of what would soon be in the Cold War, they had to essentially develop another theory of value that would come up with this and try to explain a value of in capitalism as well. And that's basically what we're going to get into today. First, before we discuss about the labor theory of value, we have to describe the labor theory of value and the subjective theory of value. One thing we have to essentially consider before we get into this is first we will describe the subjective theory of value. On Wikipedia, it is described the subjective theory of value is a theory of value which advances the idea of value of a good not determined by the inherent property of the good or nor by the labor necessary to produce the good, but instead value is determined by the importance an acting individual places on a good of achievement of his desired ends. The modern version of this theory was created independently and nearly simulated by William Stanley Jevons, Leon Walras, and Carl Migner in the late 19th century. These three individuals were a part. Well, actually, hold on. Yeah, I'm pretty sure these three individuals were entirely of like a part of like kind of the Austrian School of Economics, or even sympathized with it. In fact, Carl Migner was part of the Austrian School of Economics when this entirely happened. This is entirely theory of that was essentially set up by objectivists, or Marknerists, or or what we would call even libertarian capitalists or anarcho-capitalists in a way. And the labor theory of value. The labor theory of value is a theory of value that argues that the economic value of a good, its service, is determined on the total amount of socially necessary labor required to produce it. The labor theory of value usually is associated with Marxian economics, though it appears onto the theories earlier of classical liberal economists such as Adam Smith and David Ricardo, and also and later is also in anarchist economics. Smith saw the price of a commodity in terms of the labor of the purchaser must exploit to buy it, which embodies the concept of how much labor a commodity tool, for example, can save a purchaser. The labor theory of value is central onto the Marxist theory, which holds that the working classes exploit under capitalism disassociate price and value. Marx did not refer to his own theory of value as a labor theory of value. Uh, Mainstream and neoclassical economists reject the LTV, using the theory based on marginal utility or subjective. But we're talking about subjective theory of value here, so let's get started. What we're gonna essentially get in here is that the subjective theory of value is essentially, if we're gonna put this into practice, you essentially own a business and you have to essentially develop a great idea to produce or contribute upon to the market within the entirety of the business. You have to essentially develop an idea. Like, let's say I don't have a bowl. I don't have essentially a special bowl where I can like put it on in my car. You can develop entirely of a bowl that essentially is designed to fit inside a car and will not spill said food, said soup, whatever inside the car. You can develop that and then sell it onto the market. And that in itself, you yourself essentially develop that and have your own individual importance. And these entire goods and all these things is essentially developed just by the individual who's selling it overall, because they are the ones that essentially made the idea and they're the ones that have the individual places of it. Um, the problem is like so that's basically the subjective theory of value. It, like, again, it says the advances the idea of determined by the importance acting of the individual places, good for the achievement of the desired ends. In the modern so it's basically trying to understand or trying to essentially assume that there's even that the individual is even taking place within the functions of capitalism in the first place. The problem is here is that what we have to understand under this an idea is that we have to essentially understand what we have to understand here on what would happen. People like Carl Migner, Leon Walras, and William Stanley Jevons would argue that this entire product and like these products are essentially developed, and the pricings of these entire things and pricing the value of something is the very essence of the individual themselves, how they continue to add value. So to them, under capitalism, they can bargain the prices, but the thing is, we cannot see that today, and I don't think that has even ever happened entirely onto the actual process of capitalism. Maybe in times of feudalism or slavery where you can bargain in the prices, but not even today. I guess to clear up an example as how we can see it today, you can go to a grocery store right now, and you can try and buy a can of mac and cheese, whatever can of mac and cheese or whatever you like to eat in your lunchtime. You can try and buy a can of mac and cheese, and it costs $6. Now, you can go to the cash register, and to these people, to William Stanley Jevons, Leon Walras, and Carl Migner, to them, you can just go to the cash register and say, "Oh, this is $6. Yeah, you see, I don't necessarily like this price. This price is way too expensive. Let's say we cut it down to $2 instead." Most likely they're not going to even like sell you the price, because to them, because it's entirely of the cash register, or the entirety of the capitalist, they set it onto that price regardless. um and so because of that, they would essentially tell you to, okay, well, you have to pay for the price entirely. If you're not going to pay for the price entirely and you're going to take it anyways, then we are going to call the cops. like, or they're going to call security or something like that, to basically just like take the product back and get you arrested for possibly shoplifting or stealing. So yeah, and this is entirely of like the problem here with the subjective theory of value. It's implying that we can essentially bargain our prices, regardless, which you cannot do into when you are buying like products or entire needs of any of these things. The problem is here is that we have to essentially define like why is this essentially uh bargained, or this is essentially the price that it is today. Um, the subjective theory of value thing would basically say a diamond is the price that it is, of how high it is because it serves the philosophical need, which is just simply, I would say, not exactly the case, because the thing is here is that we have to understand why that would be the case. Let's look at the process of finding a diamond. Diamonds are one of the rarest items you can ever find entirely. Um, they are one of the rarest items you can entirely find, entirely within Africa, and even like even into Western Asia and all these things. They are very rare to find, and if you are able to find it, it takes a long time for you to even cultivate it, or to even cultivate it, or like polish it, so that way it can be sold entirely to a market, into a company here in the United States or anywhere of like the entirety of the market, to the highest bit, to someone who buys it. This is this is the case. This is not just because of the entirety of like, oh, how the individual feels on this. Because if it was, then we would essentially be able to see that this diamond could essentially be taken, or be taken entirely, regardless of the price, whatever, and could be taken by the individual based on their hands, which simply not the case under capitalism. The individual doesn't have that power. The consumer doesn't have that power under capitalism. It is dependent onto the price of the capitalist, the bourgeoisie, how they put the price on it. It is really defined onto the labor time, or the amount of labor power that is essentially put into this, and it essentially drives up that price based on that entire labor. Even Adam Smith, a neoclassical liberal, or even what we would consider as the one of the main philosophers of capitalism, even essentially even developed under that idea. These commodities are essentially produced for the sake of exchange value, and a value of exchange to essentially buy and sell any of these products onto its regard. This is not the case. This is very much the case under capitalism, when we have essentially commodities based on exchange value, and there's essentially a capital to be gained out of this. Capital under this instance being the accumulation of labor. I'm not going to call capital as the tools of production. I don't know why entirely like economic classes call it that, but because like you don't because you when you define like entirely of a GDP and like of its per capita, that's not entirely their tools. That is like the money like onto their expenditures that's going on. That's moving on. A lot of things that the subjective theory of value essentially also fails to consider is on how is like the math on how wages are determined as well, and even wages are determined. A worker does put in time and puts in entirely labor power and labor time within the workplace, and essentially would develop a product here. Let's say this product essentially took 2 hours. The specific product took 2 hours to make, and that in its cost would basically cost in an estimates of $20. Now there's more, so it costs $20 for this to entirely happen. Now there's multiple ways on the capitalist can handle this. He can, if he wants to essentially get profit and pay a worker a wage, essentially onto a fair wage, they can essentially spike up the price, fix the price up to $40, into the entirety of the market. Or if they're facing competition that's also selling it for $40, they can entirely sell it for $20 or even lower if that's the case. But here's the thing though. the capitalist also needs to essentially buy resources and needs to maintain onto the workplace as well, so that way the workday can essentially keep going on under this factor. So he can, so what he can do is essentially fix up the price, or he can cut the entirety of the wage of the worker as well, and essentially not pay them. And not even pay them $20, not to pay them $20, but instead pay them $10 based on how much they're worth, based on like the labor time that they actually produced in, and thus essentially spending, but obviously this is under the assumption that this is even being paid onto the $40 entirely. But if there's entire competition and they had to essentially lower the price or make the price as it usually is, then they would have to cut it to $5. They'll give the worker $5 to make, so that way they can buy, entirely of other products, maintenance, resources, materials, etc. So that way the workday can keep going, and that would essentially leave them with essentially some money left, so that way they can save it up. Either way, this is not essentially evil in a way. This is not entirely evil or bad in any way, shape, or form. But the problem is here is that the fact that essentially their existence as a class and the fact that their entire employment cycle of the wage worker is essentially exploitive to the worker, because it alienates them from their labor, and essentially doesn't give them entirely of the actual money of the money that essentially they actually put in within the time of this labor. Um, we have to do the math here, but the subjective theory of value, under this assumption that this entirely of pricing is essentially subjective and doesn't actually really give like doesn't really actually do the math on or understanding onto like the or under kind of like does the math or essentially does any form of like essentially calculations mathematically for the entire the weight for the entire the wage or the price to essentially be determined. It only essentially raises more questions on how the entirety of this economics structure is essentially established under capitalism. All you have done is essentially described onto the competition and the entire competition process and the entire mindset of the bourgeois, without explaining onto how the bourgeois would pay his worker, would go entirely onto the market process, or even be able to sell the entirety of the cost to sell the product. This is the problem here with entire Austrian School of Economics and even classical economists and economic schools, even here in the United States, and not only that, but also most of Western Europe as well. This is the entirety of the problem. They they would cling to this and say that this is entirely the case, without essentially doing the math onto how wages are determined and how entirely of how labor is essentially put into said product for the weight for the price to be garnered, and this is entirely the problem. I guess what we can say onto this conclusion is that at least what we can essentially say onto this conclusion is that really this entire subjective theory of value just doesn't really make any sense. You can say the entirety of the production for use onto its use value can be subjective, because because a use value is essentially based onto your own use is based onto own use and the entirety of the needs of others. That is subjective, yes. Because it is based onto the individual's use. But this is not the case under capitalism. We exchange things. We use a medium of exchange. We use money to essentially circulate it, and for things to be bought from, not based on the other needs of others, rather by exchange. This is so you can't say that this is subjective, because exchange does have a price. If it didn't, then there's no exchange in the first place. Period. And so to say that this subjective theory of value essentially applies into our modern day economics is just completely false. It doesn't. You describe the market competition entirely of these things and like trait and kind of like onto all these things, but the thing is you can't. The thing is, it fails to entirely do the math as well, and it even fails to even explain on how the bourgeois, the boss, even gets money in the first place. How the entire the bourgeois gets money in the first place. It makes it seem like the employer class is essentially a hard working class and essentially doesn't really even get paid anything, which is simply not the case, because if they didn't, then there would be no business. In there again, it goes back to the same logic. There would be no business without the boss getting money. Exactly. So they would have to essentially pay their worker, and they would have to pay them entirely like a wage that is actually not worth onto the time of labor that they put in, or else they won't get money. If they were to, then the entirety of their business would just fall, because I already just explained that. What we can essentially understand here is that, at least onto this theory, is that under this understanding, is that the labor theory of value does actually apply here, and right, and like essentially products and all these things is essentially determined based on the labor time or the labor power that is essentially put into this, and is only subjective or fixed up or fixed down once it reaches the market, not onto the entirety of the value itself. So because if there wasn't, then there would be no way for essentially things to be distributed like ethically or effectively under like in the entirety of the market system. This is the reason why. This is why we essentially have overproduction of like essentially low price goods, or even then we have underproduction of high price goods. This is why we just even had overproduction in the first place. And even then, what we have to understand here is that we have to understand here is that because of this very system, when essentially the products of labor and the products essentially sold based on the labor time or the labor power within the entirety of the product is based on sold of that either going up or going down, cutting the wage of the worker, or making the cost of the consumer buying that product. Either way, someone is basically getting financially exploited in a way. Again, this is not necessarily a moral argument. This is not the bourgeois being a bad person. This is not entirely a moral argument. I'm not saying anyone's bad here or anyone's evil in a way, but this is just what happens, and it is exploitive to a worker. Um, and and at least with the labor theory of value, it actually does the math on how essentially a wage is determined within capitalism, with the subjective theory of value only really explaining on how onto like really the market process, which even then the labor theory of value also explains as well. I'd say a lot more in detail. So yeah, I don't know. I'd urge you, and I urge myself, which I already do. I urge you and every other people to essentially understand the labor theory of value, that it does entirely apply here. Subjective theory of value only applies under the production of use value, which is not under the main, which is not the case in capitalism, when its main essence is based on the value of exchange, i.e., exchange value. So yeah, that's what we have to essentially understand here. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked the video, then hit the like button down below. I'd very much appreciate it. If you're new to my channel, hit the subscribe button. I would also very much appreciate it. And yeah, check out my other videos onto like the entirety of, I guess, my critique on capitalism, and I guess explaining onto I guess economic ideas as well. Under this kind of like very essence, under like this very essence and understanding of economics. Thank you for watching, and yeah, Socialist Links is out.